Our Lady of the Flowers by Jean Genet, page 81. Divine appeared in Paris to lead her public life about 20 years before her death. She was then thin and vivacious, and will remain so until the end of her life, though growing angular. At about 2 a.m., she entered Graff's Café in Montmartre. The customers were a muddy, still, shapeless clay. Divine was limpid water. In the big café with the closed windows and the curtains drawn on their hollow rods, overcrowded and foundering in smoke, she wafted the coolness of scandal, which is the coolness of a morning breeze, the astonishing sweetness of a breath of scandal on the stone of the temple. And just as the wind turned leaves, so she turned heads, heads which all at once became light, giddy heads. Heads of bankers, shopkeepers, gigolos for ladies, waiters, manager, colonels, scarecrows. She sat down alone at a table and asked for tea. "Specially fine China tea, my good man," she said to the waiter, with a smile. For the customer she had an irritatingly jaunty smile, hence the you-know-what in the wagging of the heads. For the poet and the reader, her smile will be enigmatic. That evening, she was wearing a champagne silk short-sleeved blouse, a pair of blue trousers stolen from a sailor, and leather sandals. On one of her fingers, though preferably on the pinky, an ulcer-like stone gangrened her. When the tea was brought, she drank it as if she were at home, in tiny little sips, a pigeon, putting down and lifting the cup with her pinky in the air. Here is a portrait of her. Her hair is brown and curly, with the curls spilling over her eyes and down her cheeks. She looks as if she were wearing a cat o' nine tails on her head. Her forehead is somewhat round and smooth. Her eyes sing despite their despair, and their melody moves from her eyes to her teeth, to which she gives life, and from her teeth to all her movements, to her slightest acts. And this charm, which emerges from her eyes, unfurls in wave upon wave down to her bare feet. Her body is as fine as amber. Her limbs can be agile when she flees from ghosts. At her heels, the wings of terror bear her along. She is quick, for in order to elude the ghosts, to throw them off her track, she must speed ahead faster than her thought thinks. She drank her tea before 30 pairs of eyes, which belied what the contemptuous, spiteful, sorrowful, wilting mouths were saying. Divine was full of grace, and yet was like all those prowlers at country fairs on the lookout for rare sights and artistic visions, good sports who trail behind them all the inevitable hodgepodge of sideshows. At the slightest movement, if they knot their tie, if they flick the ash of their cigarette, they set slot machines in motion. Divine, knotted, garroted arteries. Her seductiveness will be implacable. If it were only up to me, I would make her the kind of fatal hero I like. Fatal, that is, determining the fate of those who gaze at them, spellbound. I would make her with hips of stone, flat and polished cheeks, heavy eyelids, pagan knees so lovely that they reflected the desperate intelligence of the faces of mystics. I would strip her of all sentimental trappings. Let her consent to be the frozen statue. But I know that the poor demiurge is forced to make his creature in his own image, and that he did not invent Lucifer. In my cell, little by little, I shall have to give my thrills to the granite. I shall remain alone with it for a long time, and I shall make it live with my breath and the smell of my farts, both the solemn and the mild ones. It will take me an entire book to draw her from her petrifaction, and gradually impart my suffering to her, gradually deliver her from evil, and hold her by the hand, lead her to saintliness. The waiter who served her felt very much like snickering, but out of decency he did not dare in front of her. As for the manager, he approached her table and decided that as soon as she finished her tea, he would ask her to leave, to make sure she would not turn up again some other evening. Finally, she patted her snowy forehead with a flowered handkerchief. Then she crossed her legs. On her ankle could be seen a chain, fastened by a locket which we know contained a few hairs. She smiled all around, and each one answered only by turning away. But that was a way of answering. The whole cafe thought that the smile of, for the colonel, the invert, for the shopkeepers, the fairy, for the banker and the waiters, the fag, for the gigolos, that one, etc., was despicable. Divine did not press the point. From a tiny black satin purse, she took a few coins, which she laid noiselessly on the marble table. The cafe disappeared, and Divine was metamorphosed into one of those monsters that are painted on walls, chimeras or griffins, for a customer, in spite of himself, murmured a magic word as he thought of her. Homosexual. That evening, her first in Montmartre, she was cruising, but she got nowhere. She came upon us without warning. The habitués of the café had neither the time, nor, above all, the composure, to handle properly their reputations or their females. Having drunk her tea, Divine with indifference, so it appeared, seeing her, wriggling in a spray of flowers and strewing swishes and spangles with an invisible fur below, made off. So here she is, having decided to return, lifted by a column of smoke, to her garret, on the door of which is nailed a huge, discolored muslin rose. Her perfume is violent and vulgar. From it, we can already tell that she is fond of vulgarity. Divine has sure taste, good taste, and it is most upsetting that life always puts someone so delicate into vulgar positions, into contact with all kinds of filth. She cherishes vulgarity because her greatest love was for a dark-skinned gypsy. On him, under him, when his mouth pressed to hers, he sang to her gypsy songs that pierced her body. She learned to submit to the charm of such vulgar cloths as silk and gold braid, which are becoming to immodest persons. Montmartre was aflame. Divine passed through its multicolored fires, then intact, entered the darkness of the promenade of the Boulevard de Clichy, a darkness that preserves old and ugly faces. It was 3 a.m. She walked for a while toward Pigalle. She smiled and stared at every man who strolled by alone. They didn't dare, or else it was that she still knew nothing about the customary routine. The client's qualms, his hesitations, his lack of assurance as soon as he approaches the coveted youngster. She was weary. She sat down on a bench, and despite her fatigue was conquered, transported by the warmth of the night. She let herself go for the length of a heartbeat and expressed her excitement as follows. The nights are mad about me. Oh, the sultanas, my God, they're making eyes at me. They're curling my hair around their fingers, the fingers of the night men's cocks. They're patting my cheek, stroking my butt. That was what she thought, though without rising to or sinking into a poetry cut off from the terrestrial world. Poetic expression will never change her state of mind. She will always be the tart concerned with gain. There are mornings when all men experience with fatigue a flush of tenderness that makes them horny. One day at dawn, I found myself placing my lips lovingly, though for no reason at all, on the icy banister of the Rue Berthe. Another time, kissing my hand. Still another time, bursting with emotion. I wanted to swallow myself by opening my mouth very wide and turning it over my head so that it could take in my whole body. And then the universe, until all that would remain of me would be a ball of eaten thing which, little by little, would be annihilated. That is how I see the end of the world. Divine offered herself to the night in order to be devoured by it tenderly and never again spewed forth. She is hungry, and there is nothing around. The pissoirs are empty. The promenade is just about deserted, merely some bands of young workmen whose whole disorderly adolescence is manifest in their carelessly tied shoelaces which hop about on their insteps, returning home in forced marches from an evening of pleasure. Their tight-fitting jackets are like fragile breastplates or shells protecting the naivete of their bodies. But by the grace of their virility, which is still as light as a hope, they are inviolable by Divine. She will do nothing tonight. The possible customers were so taken by surprise that they were unable to collect their wits. She will have to go back to her attic with hunger in her belly and her heart. She stood up to go. A man came staggering toward her. He bumped her with his elbow. "Oh, sorry," he said, "terribly sorry." His breath reeked of wine. "Quite all right," said the Queen. It was darling Daintyfoot going by. Description of darling: height, 5'9". Weight, 165 pounds. Oval face, blonde hair, blue-green eyes, matte complexion, perfect teeth, straight nose. He was young too, almost as young as Divine, and I would like him to remain so to the end of the book. Every day the guards open my door so I can leave my cell and go out into the yard for some fresh air. For a few seconds, in the corridors and on the stairs, I pass thieves and hoodlums whose faces enter my face and whose bodies, from afar, hurl mine to the ground. I long to have them within reach, yet not one of them makes me evoke darling Daintyfoot. When I met Divine in Frey's prison, she spoke to me about him a great deal, seeking his memory and the traces of his steps throughout the prison. But I never quite knew his face, and this is a tempting opportunity for me to blend him in my mind with the face and physique of Roger. Very little of this Corsican remains in my memory. A hand with too massive a thumb that plays with a tiny hollow key, and the faint image of a blond boy walking up La Canebière in Marseille, with a small chain, probably gold, stretched across his fly, which it seems to be buckling. He belongs to a group of males who are advancing upon me with the pitiless gravity of forests on the march. That was the starting point of the daydream, in which I imagined myself calling him Roger, a little boy's name, though firm and upright. Roger was upright. I had just got out of the Shah prison, and I was amazed not to have met him there. What could I commit to be worthy of his beauty? I needed boldness in order to admire him. For lack of money, I slept at night in the shadowy corners of the coal piles on the docks, and every evening I carried him off with me. The memory of his memory made way for other men. For the past 2 days in my daydreams, I have again been mingling his made-up life with mine. I wanted him to love me, and of course he did, with the candor that required only perversity for him to be able to love me. For 2 successive days I have fed with his image a dream which is usually sated after 4 or 5 hours, when I have given it a boy to feed upon, however handsome he may be. Now I am exhausted with inventing circumstances in which he loves me more and more. I am worn out with the invented trips, thefts, rapes, burglaries, imprisonments, and treachery in which we were involved, each acting by and for the other, and never by or for himself, in which the adventure was ourselves, and only ourselves. I am exhausted. I have a cramp in my wrist. The pleasure of the last drops is dry. For a period of 2 days, between my 4 bare walls, I experienced with him and through him every possibility of an existence that had to be repeated 20 times and got so mixed up it became more real than a real one. I have given up the daydream. I was loved. I have quit, the way a contestant in a 6-day bicycle race quits. Yet the memory of his eyes and their fatigue, which I have to cull from the face of another youngster whom I saw coming out of a brothel, a boy with firm legs and ruthless cock, so solid that I might almost say it was knotted, and his face, it alone, seen without its veil, which asks for shelter like a knight-errant. This memory refuses to disappear, as the memory of my dream friends usually does. It floats about. It is less sharp than when the adventures were taking place, but it lives in me, nevertheless. Certain details persist more obstinately in remaining. The little hollow key with which, if he wants to, he can whistle. His thumb, his sweater, his blue eyes. If I continue, he will rise up, become erect, and penetrate me so deeply that I shall be marked with stigmata. I can't bear it any longer. I am turning him into a character whom I shall be able to torment in my own way, namely, darling Daintyfoot. He will still be 20, although his destiny is to become the father and lover of Our Lady of the Flowers. To Divine, he said, "Terribly sorry." In his cups, Darling did not notice the strangeness of this passer-by with his aggressive niceness. "What about it, pal?" Divine stopped. A bantering and dangerous conversation ensued, and then everything happened as was to be desired. Divine took him home with her to the Rue Caulecon. It was in this garret that she died, the garret from which one sees below, like the sea beneath the watchman in the crow's nest, a cemetery and graves, cypresses singing, ghosts dozing. Every morning Divine will shake her dust rag from the window and bid the ghosts farewell. One day, with the help of field glasses, she will discover a young gravedigger. "God forgive me," she will exclaim. "There's a bottle of wine on the vault." This gravedigger will grow old along with her and will bury her without knowing anything about her. So she went upstairs with Darling. Then, in the attic, after closing the door, she undressed him. With his jacket, trousers, and shirt off, he looked as white and sunken as an avalanche. By evening they found themselves tangled in the damp and rumpled sheets. "What a mess! Man, I was pretty groggy yesterday, wasn't I, doll?" He laughed feebly and looked around the garret. It is a room with a sloping ceiling. On the floor, Divine has put some threadbare rugs and nailed to the wall the murderers on the walls of my cell, and the extraordinary photographs of good-looking kids which she has stolen from photographers' display windows, all of whom bear the signs of the power of darkness. Display window! On the mantelpiece, a tube of phenobarbital lying on a small painted wooden frigate is enough to detach the room from the stone block of the building, to suspend it like a cage between heaven and earth. From the way he talks, the way he lights and smokes his cigarette, Divine has gathered that Darling is a pimp. At first, she had certain fears of being beaten up, robbed, insulted. Then she felt the proud satisfaction of having made a pimp come. Without quite seeing where the adventure would lead, but rather as a bird is said to go into the serpent's mouth, she said, not quite voluntarily and in a kind of trance, Stay, and added hesitantly, if you want to. No kidding? You feel that way about me? Darling stayed in that big Montmartre attic where, through the skylight between the pink muslin puffs, which she has made herself, Divine sees white cradles sailing by on a calm blue sea, so close that she can make out her flowers from which emerges the arched foot of a dancer. Darling will soon bring the midnight blue overalls that he wears on the job, his ring of skeleton keys and his tools, and on the little pile which they make on the floor he will place his white rubber gloves, which are like gloves for formal occasions. Thus began their life together, in that room, through which ran the electric wires of the stolen radiator, the stolen radio, and the stolen lamps. They eat breakfast in the afternoon. During the day, they sleep and listen to the radio. Toward evening, they primp and go out. At night, as is the practice, Divine hustles on the Place Blanche and Darling goes to the movies. For a long time, things will go well with Divine. With Darling to advise and protect her, she will know whom to rob, which judge to blackmail. The vaporish cocaine loosens the contours of their lives and sets their bodies adrift. And so, they are untouchable. Though a hoodlum, Darling had a face of light. He was the handsome male, gentle and violent, born to be a pimp, and of so noble a bearing that he always seems to be naked, save for one ridiculous, and to me, touching movement, the way he arched his back, standing first on one foot, then on the other, in order to take off his trousers and shorts. Before his birth, Darling was baptized privately, that is, beatified too, practically canonized, in the warm belly of his mother. He was given the kind of emblematic baptism which, upon his death, was to send him to limbo. In short, one of those brief ceremonies, mysterious and highly dramatic in their compactness, sumptuous too, to which the angels were convoked and in which the votaries of the divinity were mobilized, as was the divinity itself. Darling is aware of this, though only slightly. That is, throughout his life, rather than anyone's telling him such secrets aloud and intelligibly, it seems that someone whispers them to him. And this private baptism, with which his life began, gilds his life as it unfolds, envelopes it in a warm, weak, slightly luminous aureole, raises for this pimp's life a pedestal garlanded with flowers, as a maiden's coffin is bedecked with woven ivy, a pedestal massive through light, from the top of which, since the age of 15, Darling has been pissing in the following position: his legs spread, knees slightly bent, and in more rigid jets since the age of 18. For we should like to stress the point that a very gentle nimbus always isolates him from too rough a contact with his own sharp angles. If he says, "I'm dropping a pearl," or "a pearl slipped," he means that he has farted in a certain way, very softly, that the fart has flowed out very quietly. Let us wonder at the fact that it does suggest a pearl of dull sheen. The flowing, the muted leak seems to us as milky as the paleness of a pearl that is slightly cloudy. It makes Darling seem to us a kind of precious gigolo, a Hindu, a princess, a drinker of pearls. The odor he has silently spread in the prison has the dullness of the pearl, coils about him, halos him from head to foot, isolates him, but isolates him much less than does the remark that his beauty does not fear to utter. "I'm dropping a pearl" means that the fart is noiseless. If it rumbles, then it is coarse. And if it's some jerk who drops it, Darling says, "My cock's house is falling down." Wondrously, through the magic of his high blonde beauty, Darling calls forth the savannah, and plunges us more deeply and imperiously into the heart of the black continents than the Negro murderer will plunge me. Darling adds further, sure stinks. I can't even stay near me. In short, he bore his infamy like a red-hot brand on raw flesh. But this precious brand is as ennobling as the fleur-de-lis on the shoulders of hoodlums of old. Eyes blackened by fists are the pimp's shame. But Darling says, my 2 bouquets of violets. He also says, regarding a desire to shit, I've got a cigar at the tip of my lips. He has very few friends. As Divine loses hers, he sells them to the cops. Divine does not yet know about this. He keeps his traitor's face for himself alone, for he loves to betray. When Divine met him, he had just got out of jail that same morning, having served a minimum sentence for robbery and receiving stolen goods, after having coldly ratted on his accomplices and on some other friends who were not accomplices. One evening, as they were about to release him from the police station to which he had been taken after a raid, when the inspector said to him in that gruff tone that makes one think they won't go any further, you wouldn't happen to know who's going to pull a job. All you have to do is stooge for us. We can come to some arrangement. He felt, as you would say, a base caress, but it was all the sweeter because he regarded himself as base. He tried to seem nonchalant and said, it's risky business. However, he noticed that he had lowered his voice. You don't have to worry about that with me, continued the inspector. You'll get 100 francs each time. Darling accepted. He liked selling out on people, for this dehumanized him. Dehumanizing myself is my own fundamental tendency. On the first page of an evening paper, he saw again the photograph of the ensign I'd mentioned earlier, the one who was shot for treason. And Darling said to himself, old pal, buddy. He was thrilled by a prankishness that was born from within. I'm a double-crosser. As he walked down the Rue d'Ancourt, drunk with the hidden pleasure, as of a treasure, of his abjection, for it really must intoxicate us if we are not to be killed by its intensity, he glanced at the mirror in a shop window where he saw a Darling luminous with extinguished pride, bursting with this pride. He saw this Darling wearing a Glen plaid suit, a felt hat over one eye, his shoulders stiff, and when he walks he holds them like that, so as to resemble Sebastopol Pete. And Pete holds them like that, so as to resemble Polly the rat, and Polly to resemble Tiwi, and so on. A procession of pure, irreproachable pimps leading to Darling Daintyfoot, the double-crosser. And it seems that as a result of having rubbed against them and stolen their bearing, he has, you might say, soiled them with his own abjection. That's how I want him to be for my delight, with a chain on his wrist, a tie as fluid as a tongue of flame, and those extraordinary shoes which are meant only for pimps, very light tan, narrow and pointed. For thanks to Divine, Darling has gradually exchanged his clothes, which were shabby from months in a cell, for some elegant worsted suits and scented linen. The transformation has delighted him, for he is still the child pimp. The soul of the ill-tempered hoodlum has remained in the cast-offs. Now he feels in his pocket and strokes with his knife better than he used to feel his knife near his penis, a 38 caliber gun. But we do not dress for ourselves alone, and Darling dressed for prison. With each new purchase, he imagines the effect on his possible prison mates at Friends or Santé. Who, in your opinion, might they be? 2 or 3 hoods, who, never having seen him, could recognize him as their peer. A few wooden-faced men who might offer him their hand, or from a distance during the medical examination, or while returning from the daily walk, would rap out from the corner of their mouth with a wink, "Lo, darling." But Most of his friends would be jerks who were easily dazzled. Prison is a kind of god, as barbaric as a god to whom he offers gold watches, fountain pens, rings, handkerchiefs, scarves, and shoes. He dreams less of showing himself in the splendor of his new outfits to a woman, or to the people he meets casually in daily life, than of walking into a cell with his hat tilted over one eye, his white silk shirt open at the collar, for his tie was stolen during the search, and his English raglan unbuttoned. And the poor prisoners already gaze at him with respect. On the basis of his appearance, he dominates them. I'd like to see the look on their mugs, he would think, if he could think his desires. 2 stays in prison have so molded him that he will live the rest of his life for it. It has shaped his destiny, and he is very dimly aware that he is ineluctably consecrated to it. Perhaps ever since the time he read the following words that someone had scribbled on the page of a library book. Beware. First, Jean Clément, known as the Queen. Second, Robert Martin, known as the Faggot. Third, Roger Fagu, known as Nellie. The Queen has a crush on Lil Meadow, society says. The Faggot on Ferrier and Grandot. Nellie on Malvoisin. The only way to avoid the horror of horror is to give in to it. He therefore wished with a kind of voluptuous desire that one of the names were his. Besides, I know that you finally tire of that tense, heroic attitude of the outlaw, and that you decide to play along with the police in order to reassume your sloughed-off humanity. Divine knew nothing about this aspect of Darling. Had she known it, she would have loved them all the more, for to her, love was equivalent to despair. So, they are drinking tea, and Divine is quite aware she is swallowing it the way a pigeon swallows clear water, as it would be drunk if he drank it by the Holy Ghost in the form of a dove. Darling dances the Java with his hands in his pockets. If he lies down, Divine sucks him. When she talks to herself about Darling, Divine says, clasping her hands in thought, I worship him. When I see him lying naked, I feel like saying Mass on his chest. It took Darling some time to get used to talking about her and to her in the feminine. He finally succeeded, but he did not tolerate her talking to him as a girlfriend. Then, little by little, he let her do it. Divine dared say to him, You're pretty, adding, like a prick. Darling takes what comes his way in the course of his nocturnal and diurnal expeditions, and bottles of liquor, silk scarves, perfumes, and fake jewels accumulate in the garret. Each object brings into the room the fascination of a petty theft that is as brief as an appeal to the eyes. Darling steals from the display counters of department stores, from parked cars. He robs his few friends. He steals wherever he can. On Sunday, Divine and he go to Mass. Divine carries a gold-clasped missal in her right hand. With her left, she keeps the collar of her overcoat closed. They walk without seeing. They arrive at the Madeleine and take their seats among the fashionable worshippers. They believe in the bishops with gold ornaments. The Mass fills Divine with wonder. Everything that goes on there is perfectly natural. Each of the priest's gestures is clear, has its precise meaning, and might be performed by anyone. When the officiating priest joins the 2 pieces of the divided host for the consecration, the edges do not fit together. And when he raises it with his 2 hands, he does not try to make you believe in the miracle. It makes Divine shudder. Darling prays, saying, Our Mother, which art in heaven. They sometimes take communion from a mean-looking priest who maliciously crams the host into their mouths. Darling still goes to Mass because of its luxuriousness. When they get back to the garret, they fondle each other. Divine loves her man. She bakes pies for him and butters his roasts. She even dreams of him if he is in the toilet. She worships him in any and all positions. A silent key is opening the door, and the wall bursts open just as sky tears apart to reveal the man, like the one Michelangelo painted nude in The Last Judgment. When the door has been closed as gently as if it were made of glass, Darling tosses his hat on the couch and his cigarette butt any old place, though preferably to the ceiling. Divine leaps to the assault, clings to her man, licks him and envelopes him. He stands there solid and motionless, as if he were Andromeda's monster, changed to a rock in the sea.